When we talk about overheating in homes, we often imagine that dwelling as a single thermal environment. However, during preliminary conversations with a resident in East London, I began noticing that some rooms within the same home were described almost as entirely different climates. In particularly, loft converted spaces were repeatedly associated with a stronger heat exposure, discomfort, and difficulty sleeping during summer periods. This observation led me to a broader question. If overheating is experienced unevenly within the home itself, then how might this uneven exposure affect households living in economically vulnerable communities with limited adaptive capacity? Today, I would like to share an exploratory investigation into overheating within loft-converted Victorian Terrace housing in Barking, East London. London's housing stock is increasingly exposed to summer overheating as the rising temperature intersect with an aging residential fabric originally designed for cooler historical climates. This issue becomes particularly important within economically vulnerable communities, where households often lacked access to air conditioning or expensive retrofitting interventions. In this situation, adaptation frequently depends on low-cost behavioral responses, such as opening windows, using fans, adjusting occupancy pattern, or just endure uncomfortable indoor conditions. As a result, overheating is not only a question of building performance, but also a question of social vulnerability and adaptive capacity. While research on residential overheating has expanded significantly in recent years, much of this work still focuses preliminary on technical mitigation strategies or help building scale thermal performance. Within this broader context, loft conversations represent a particularly important spatial condition. Across London, loft conversations have become increasingly common forms of resident-led adaptation within Victoria Terrace housing. However, these spaces are often characterized by lightweight construction, direct roof exposure, and constrained ventilation conditions. As a result, loft rooms may function as thermally distinct microenvironments within the dwelling itself. What makes this especially significant is that these spatial conditions often emerge within economically vulnerable neighborhoods where adaptive capacity is already limited. This study focuses on Barking in East London. Barking contains a substantial stock of Victorian terrace housing alongside relatively high level of social economic vulnerability. The area therefore provides a useful context for exploring how overheating, aging housing stock, and limited adaptive capacity intersect. Rather than treating overheating purely as a technical issue, this context allows us to consider how heat exposure may also become spatially and socially uneven within the home. At this stage, the project should be understood as an exploratory investigation rather than a fully validated and empirical study. The research combines preliminary residence conversations with spatial observation and exploratory building performance simulation thinking. The purpose is not to produce definitive quantitative conclusions, but rather to identify potentially overlooked spatial pattern of a heat exporter within the dwelling. In particular, I became interested in whether overheating might become concentrated within specific rooms rather than experienced evenly across the entire home. This exploratory approach also helped maintain attention on Loft experience and everyday behavioral adaptation. One of the clearest emerging observations from the resident conversation was the perception that loft room behaved very different from another part of the dwelling. Residents frequently described these spaces as significantly hotter, particularly during warm evening and the nighttime period. Several occupants associate loft room with difficult sleeping, daytime discomfort, and heat accumulation that persisted even after outdoor temperature has decreased. What is particularly important here is that these descriptions were often comparative rather than absolute. Residents were not necessarily describing the entire home as overheating equally. Instead, they repeatedly distinguished the loft from another room within the same dwelling. This suggests that heat exporter may become spatially concentrated with a specific part of the home. Another important observation concerned how residents adapted behaviorally to these overheating conditions. Occupants described these rooms differently throughout the day depending on thermal comfort condition. Some rooms were avoided during warm periods, while others were ventilated differently through window opening, fan using, or altered occupancy patterns. Bedrooms were often associated with stronger expectation for cooler nighttime condition, making overheating particularly disruptive for sleeping and recovery. In this sense, overheating was not simply experienced passively. It was actively negated through everyday behavioral adaptation inside the home. However, within economically vulnerable households, the ability to adapt remained limited, especially where low-cost strategies were insufficient during prolonged heat events. This observation suggests that overheating may not simply occur uniformly across the dwelling. Instead, heat exposure may become spatially concentrated within a specific room such as loft extension area. In economically vulnerable communities, this concentration of heat stress may have a direct implication for everyday comfort, sleeping quality, and well-being. Importantly, these impacts are not only technical or environmental, they are also spatial and social. This means that the lived experience of overheating may depend not only on the dwelling itself, but also on where within the dwelling occupants spend time. This early observation points towards the potential value of a more spatially sensitive approach to residential heat resilience, rather than treating the dwelling as a single thermal condition. Future research may benefit from examining room level exposure and behavioral adaptation more closely. Such approaches may help identify heating concentration of heat stress that remain overlooked within broader dwelling scale assessment. They may also support more targeted, low-cost passive adaptation strategies, particularly with economically vulnerable communities, where large-scale retrofit interventions are often unrealistic. At this stage, the intention is not to propose a complete framework, but rather than open a direction for further investigation into the relationship between spatial heat exposure and social vulnerability. To conclude, this presentation has argued that overheating may not simply be the dwelling scale condition, but also a spatially uneven experience within the home itself. Loft converted rooms may function as a concentrated zone of heat exposure relative to other spaces within the dwelling. In economically vulnerable communities, limited adaptive capacity may further intensify the consequences of this uneven exposure. Recognizing these aided spatial inequalities may therefore become increasingly important as climate pressure continue to intensify across aging urban housing stock. Thank you for listening.